Welcome everyone to RJ Julian. We have a wonderful evening planned with an outstanding author, Deborah Goodrich Royce. I'm Michael, event host at RJ Julian. After a brief introduction, we'll hear from Deborah. We'll have time for some questions from the audience, and then we'll have a book signing back. I think we'll just move some of the chairs and have it right here at the table. In fact, you can sign the book if you'd like. I would probably prefer that Deborah do that. Her newest book is Reef Road. When severed hand washes ashore in the wealthy enclave of Palm Beach, Florida, the lives of two women collide. Best-selling author Luann Rice wrote a wonderful review of this book, which I thought really captured it. Reef Road feels utterly real, a novel of deeply personal context, swerves between truth and lies, the lies that lead to an even deeper and more devastating truth. Deborah writes with brilliant understanding of the mystery and occasional grace of trauma. Deborah's previous novel, Ruby Falls, won the Zibby Award for Best Plot Twist in 2021. And Finding Mrs. Ford was hailed by Forbes, Book Riot, and Good Morning America on their best of lists in 2019. Deborah was an actress on All My Children and in multiple films before transitioning to the role of story editor at Miramax Films. More recently, in addition to writing multiple books, she and her husband have restored the Avon Theater, Savoy Bookstore, Ocean House Hotel, and numerous Main Street revitalization projects in Rhode Island and the Catskills. Now we'll hear from Deborah Goodrich Royce.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming on this rainy night. So on December the 10th, 1948 in Pittsburgh, it was a Friday night. My mother and her best friend had gone to their Lutheran church's Christmas pageant practice, and my mother was supposed to go to her friend's house that night. And for whatever reason, my grandmother said no. This was in a section of Pittsburgh that was a very working class section. It's called Homewood Brushton. Anybody from Pittsburgh here? So it's quite derelict now, but then it was, respectable. And these were row houses attached on either side, like you'd see in a city, with a door in the front and a door in the back. The parents were really adamant when they went out bowling that they asked their daughter, whose real name, I'm talking about the real case now, her name was Carol. They asked her to lock the front door, they asked her to lock the back door. She assured them she would. She was baking a cake in the kitchen. They left at 8:30, and then the parents returned at 11:30 that night. There was a strange lag in time from when the parents returned at 11:30 and 21 minutes later, when two things happened. When the father called the police and the mother ran outside of the house screaming. I talk about the 21-minute lag in the book. But she was in the kitchen baking the cake. There was a trail of blood that went from the kitchen to the dining room. There was a three-legged telephone table, which was upright when they returned. The phone was off the hook. And she had been stabbed 36 times. And excuse me, she was still alive. I'm not sick, I just had sushi. So right. The parents ran out of the house 21 minutes later. The mom did, the dad called the police, they took her in, she was pronounced dead on arrival. Over the course of the next 4 years, great suspicion fell on the brother. That is not something my mother knew at the time. I had always heard about this story, but I can tell you now what I heard about from my mother, even though she was an adult, was really the perspective of a 12-year-old child. I mean, that is really what she absorbed. My mother learned about it the next morning. My grandmother had sent my mother to the bakery, and she's standing in the bakery and everybody's whispering and talking about something. And as it comes clear to her what they're talking about, she is completely driven to the spot and just blurts out, she is my best friend, using still the present tense. So there's an interesting phenomenon with acts of extreme violence. And there's something that happens to people next door to it, if you will. There's generational trauma. So we do inherit at some level, and we can talk about all aspects of this tonight, including epigenetics, which is so fascinating to me. Like are our genes changed somehow by the trauma of our grandparents? And there's also something that happens to those of us who know someone who suffers violence, or it happens in some proximity to us. So I've always been intrigued by that phenomenon. I knew my mother was affected by this actual murder. In what way? I would say it made her, fearful, overly cautious, somewhat overprotective. The invention of the home security alarm system was a very good thing for my mother, but her understanding of what happened, she thought it was really an intruder that came from the outside, that there was some stranger who had penetrated the house and had killed her friend, which was a particular type of perspective, which led to a particular level of fear on her behalf. So when the pandemic shut us down in spring of 2020, and you can think back to, for me, like ground zero was Friday, March 13th. It was my granddaughter's birthday. She was turning 1. And there was that day of like, do we have cake? Do we not have cake? Do we have anybody over? Can we get a cake? What are we going to do? And then the world shut down. So I was in Florida and I decided at that point, my schedule was free and clear, like all of our schedules. I would finally research this real murder. I would take a look at what had happened. Well, lo and behold, no surprise to anyone. Now there's a huge trove of material on the internet. So I started down that rabbit hole. And so there were 2 things I was looking at simultaneously, which will lead to the development of Reef Road. All of the research I was doing about the real murder in 1948, and then the setting I was in Palm Beach, and I would ride my bike around the island, and I could go basically up and down the roads riding my bikes because nobody was anywhere. It was like the Twilight Zone, and the beaches had do not enter tape, and you couldn't go anywhere. And there was this dovetailing of what I was researching and the place in which I was doing the research. And so I thought long and hard about how I wanted to approach this real crime. As I said, suspicion had always fallen on the brother. I also happen to know that the case was reopened in 2008, and I know many details of why and how it was reopened and how it went. And I will tell you how I knew that. But I thought, I don't want to approach this as nonfiction. I don't want to really get into that business of entering into the lives of that family. I'm not a family member. I mean, those people wouldn't know me truly if they passed me on the street. And the fictional version of it, I think you can get much more readily to the essence of truth through fiction than you can through nonfiction. If you're talking about just the purity of what you want to say. So I wanted to explore this idea of conferred trauma. And in the real case, for example, the girl who was murdered had 2 brothers, though suspicion fell on one. She was 12. The 19-year-old brother is really the brother in question, but then there was a 24-year-old brother. And once I started writing, and I had one of my dear friends and beta readers read an early draft, she said, well, what's with the second brother? It's just confusing. I mean, which brother is which? And I thought, well, in fiction, you can just exit brother 2 stage left. You don't need him. And out he goes. The writer Alice McDermott was talking about fiction versus nonfiction. And she said, in nonfiction, you have to endeavor to include everything. You have to put it all in. In fiction, what you're really seeking to do is, from the absolute limitlessness of your own imagination, is put a box around the story that you're trying to create. So that was an easier vehicle for me to explore the concept. So as I was looking at that, because my mind works in a certain way, and I love a good thriller, and I love a good twist. And I like to call my books identity thrillers. They're really examinations of secrets and the people who keep them, and just this slow peeling of the onion and getting to the point where you realize things are not at all what you seem. And I think I must have watched at around that moment or rewatched the film noir Body Heat. Have any of you seen it? It was done in the 80s. I highly recommend it. Kathleen Turner and William Hurt. And it's set in Lantana, Florida, which is just near where I was writing. And it's typical film noir, but it's in Florida. So everybody's hot and everybody's sweaty and everybody's really bad. They're all bad. But in film noir, you always need to look to the woman. You need to pay very close attention to the woman and what she is up to. And it's probably not what you're being told. So the book started to evolve into what it is now. It's a dual narrative. You have two storylines playing out in Palm Beach in the heat and claustrophobia of that COVID lockdown. And we can talk about why I chose that setting. You have the story of a writer, and her chapters are called A Writer's Thoughts. And they really are like journal entries. You are in her head. She's talking in first person. It's very meta. There's a self-referential quality. You know, she knows she's writing and she's talking to you at times, which was sort of a risky thing to do. And then alternating with that, there are these chapters called The Wife. And that The Wife exists like a book within a book. And it's the story of a younger woman, a beautiful 40-ish year-old woman named Linda Alonso, who's married to a very handsome fellow from Argentina by the name of Miguel Alonso. And they have two little children, Diego and Esperanza. They call them Gogo and SB. And about 3 weeks into the COVID lockdown, Miguel and the children disappear. And Linda calls the police and they track them down to security camera footage at Miami International Airport in their face masks, of course, because of the period in which it is. And they are getting on a plane for Buenos Aires. And she can't follow because the borders are closed to all but non-Argentine citizens. So Reef Road is this toggling back and forth, and it starts slowly and it gets faster and faster and faster and faster and faster between the writer and the wife and what is really going on and whether or not one storyline has anything to do with the other. The pandemic, I felt, was the perfect setting for a thriller of this nature. And a lot of writers have talked about avoiding pandemic settings. But if you think about a wartime setting, you know that there are certain constraints around your characters. And constraints fit a thriller extremely well. They fit most kinds of fictions very well. So like Linda Alonso is unable to follow her husband to Buenos Aires. She's unable to see what happens to her children. She can't reach them on the phone. So the tension is building for her. So she's boxed in by it. And while the book isn't really about the pandemic, it's an underpinning and it's something that we live through. And it's a setting, I think, that serves to increase the kind of coming unravel aspect that each of these women is going through. So how do I know the case was reopened in 2008? So as you mentioned, my husband and I do a lot of restoration. And one of the places we've done a lot of restoration is in the Catskill Mountains. And a fellow that we've worked with a lot is a prosecutor who happened to run the New York State Prosecutors Training Institute. And around the year 2008, I was telling him about this real murder and my mother and all of this. And I told him all the circumstances, such as I understood at the time, and he said it was the brother. I said, well, how do you know that it was the brother? He said, you don't stab someone 36 times unless it's personal. So a little time passed and he called me. He had spoken to the Pittsburgh Police Department. They had found the dossier on the brother. There was a whole history of arrests of him from exposing himself to girls. He was a flasher, which does not, of course, make you a murderer, but it indicates a certain impulse control problem, we can safely say. So the cops got very excited about this. They sent a whole team of rookies down into the property room. They found a box that had fabric in it, and it was really the 60-year mark from the real murder. And they were ecstatic. They thought they were going to get a 60-year-old DNA conviction and they could nail this guy. So they sent the fabric to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia. It turned out it was horribly degraded. So that angle was out. They brought the brother in. He failed his polygraph test, which apparently is not dispositive of anything, but they brought him in, they questioned him several times in the company of his wife. And for them, what sort of sealed the deal in their minds, but not in actual, the case was dropped again. But at a certain point, the wife looked at the husband and started screaming. And I put all this in the book. She said, you didn't do this, did you? Tell me you didn't do this. Tell me you didn't do this. And the cops were like, he totally did this. But that was the end of it. Nothing ever happened. What it did for my mother, in a really weird way, it didn't lessen the trauma of the fact that her friend was murdered, but it lessened for her this sense that danger could just fly in the window randomly. So in a weird way, it was a slight settler in her mind. I do know that the brother is still alive. I Google him from time to time. I don't mention the real case. It is truly not hard to find. If that is your proclivity, it is knowable. It's all out there. And the most fascinating thing for me now about Reef Road is the reception it's getting. As I wrote this book, I kept thinking, does this even work? It's two very different styles of narratives. Is it too different for people? It's an Indie Next selection for the month of January, which is a wonderful honor because there are only 25 books chosen by the American Booksellers Association. So it's one of those. It just made the Publishers Weekly bestseller list. It's getting phenomenal reviews, starred Kirkus reviews and all that. So for those of you who are writers out there, and I see you taking notes, so I'm sure you're a writer. The real point to me is you just have to write what you write, and you never can figure out what people are going to understand or not. You just have no idea. If you write for yourself, you're a person. So by extension, you're writing for some other people. You don't know who, you don't know how many, but you can't ever game what other people are going to understand. You have no idea. So it's been really gratifying that there's been this understanding and embracing of the book. I was on CNN 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about Ted Bundy, and this was a very interesting little sidebar. They rarely bring fiction on CNN, but I got to go on because of this crazy nonfiction inspiration. And I was on a show with Jim Acosta and this reporter named Chloe Malas, and Chloe was really covering the Idaho murders. So we got to talking about that. I played the woman who married Ted Bundy opposite Mark Harmon in the 1980, whatever, 86 miniseries about Bundy. So I hadn't seen it for 30 years. And CNN said, give us some clips before we air this. So for me to find somehow this mini series from 30 years ago, I don't know how you find it. So I finally found this source on the internet, like Marcy's Movies, and she had done it with her little home taping machine back in the day. There it was on YouTube. But the interesting thing, it was very grainy. So I sat and watched it till 1 a.m, getting my little clips down to the second, which of course CNN never used. But I was really glad I saw it. It really held up. And we were talking before we started about Bundy and the Volkswagen Beetle and taking the seat out and the door handle and everything. But it really did hold up as a movie. I think it was strongly done. So the idea about characters, and I know I'm only supposed to talk about half an hour, characters and how do you get into the head of characters when you're writing? And I think it's a very similar process to what an actor does. My process is the following. I don't know how everybody does it. I think all of us are operating with the same palette of emotions, unless we're sociopaths. So forget about Bundy. I don't know how you play Bundy. But given that we all have the same palette of emotions, they exist at different levels. There are gradations. So let's say you're playing a murderer or writing a murderer. How do you do it? Well, you think about what that person, is it lust or greed or envy or jealousy? And then you just ramp it up, ramp it down, and dig into yourself and use your understanding as best you can of what that emotional package is. And I think it's the best way to really get to character from a realistic standpoint. So people always say, well, which one of these characters is you? They all are. I think if you're writing it, they all are. You're putting something of yourself into the life of the characters. So these two women, the writer and the wife, they're very unreliable. I can really assure you of that. They're very different types of characters. But you have to find that little piece of yourself to put in it and then go from there. Do you want to just go to questions now? We can sort of open this up and
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
I do. Yeah, I'll get things started. And it kind of relates to what you were talking about with the characters, how there are parts of you in each of those. It's always interesting at author events to hear any of the secret details or settings or little things that are added into the book that maybe have particular meaning or that people might not realize are special unless they've been here. So is there anything in the book, a setting or a particular character or something like that is kind of like a...
So let's talk about setting. I write real places. My first book takes place in Watch Hill, Rhode Island and Detroit, Michigan. Watch Hill in 2014 and Detroit in 1979. The second book takes place primarily in Los Angeles in the late 80s. And this book, of course, mostly in Palm Beach. And I love writing real places, and I love reading books that have real places. I get very excited when a writer mentions a place I know, or I've been, or I recognize. I'm like, oh my God, I've been to that cafe. And I have a lot of friends who write fictitious places, and that's just a different kind of choice. So this book is steeped in Palm Beach. And there's a quotation that is sometimes attributed to Carl Hyacin about Florida. And it is also attributed to Somerset Maugham about the French Riviera in the 1920s. A sunny place for shady people. And that's exactly what I want you to feel in this book. I want you to get the sense of the heat, of the humidity, of the bugginess of this shutdown. I mentioned different businesses, shops. Reef Road is a real street. So as I'm riding my bike around, I started to zero in for Linda Alonso on the north end of the island of Palm Beach. And this is one of these barrier islands. There's the intracoastal, and all these islands just go down, I think, North and South Carolina and Florida. On the north end of Palm Beach, it's very residential. You have a lot of bedroom ranch houses, very straight streets, kids' bicycles tipped over. On the south end of the island of Palm Beach, you have the estate section. Those are the mansions, the empty mansions of seasonal visitors. And for Linda, I wanted her to live on the north end, she and her young family, because that would be the place a young family would live. And as I'm going around looking at these streets, their names like Dolphin or Banyan, and that's nice. And then I saw Reef Road and I thought, oh, that sounds slightly perilous, like a coral reef, like you could run aground. It reminds me of Lookout Mountain or Cape Fear, one of those places that's ominous. And cover, and I'd love to talk about cover. One of the first covers we were playing with was a street sign of Reef Road. And I always have movie references for everything I talk about. But if you remember Sunset Boulevard, the title of it was a painted street sign on the curb in Beverly Hills, which was dingy and nicked up. And so we tried for that at first, but it looked a little Pulp Fiction. But let me go on to the cover. So doing a cover like this is really fascinating because I have a lot of involvement. So there are a few things going on. When we zeroed in on the bird of paradise, it's very pretty, but putting it off to the side changes the feeling. When we looked at versions of it right in the center, and it looks like such lovely literary fiction that you're going to have such a nice story about these nice people. So moving it off to the side, and then when you look really closely, these very sharp leaves are stabbing the letters of my name and stabbing here. So there's a violence to it. And there's a spider right here. So if my other book covers, they're always something very pretty, but something really off going on. And when you put a cup, so this is a hydrangea, and snaking through the hydrangea is this weird gold necklace with a question mark on it, which is a plot point. And so that's that. And this cover, so there's an artist named Melanie Wilhide who got her MFA at Yale, and she was preparing to do a show in California, and her computer was stolen. And about 3 weeks later, the cops got her computer back, and she was trying desperately to retrieve her work, and the thief had tried to wipe the computer clean. So when it came back, everything was kind of sliced and diced, and you'll see pieces of this girl's face, her eyes over here and over there. And Melanie said, I love that. And she created a whole show around this, which she dedicated to her thief. So when we saw this cover, we decided that it was perfect. And another funny story about this cover. So we spend time in Watch Help. And I do not know Taylor Swift, but I know her father, Scott Swift, very nice guy. So a couple of years ago, I was telling about all this and the cover, and he said, you need to put a shout out in the back of your book. You need to, my daughter does that. So we did the shout out to the story. But anyway, here, so the spider. When you put a spider on a book cover, there's great conversation of how gross the spider can be or not be. Because if it's hairy and mottled and too big and disgusting, there are people who will not touch your book. So I think we have the perfect sort of silhouette of the spider. So the book, going back to your question about place, it is Palm Beach. And because the writer goes on these digressions in her chapters, and if you remember in, I'm having a total brain, Holden Caulfield. To Kill a Mockingbird. Holden Caulfield, when he's in class, he gets very upset because the teacher wants them to call out the other students when they're digressing and say, digression, He's like, but I love digressions, it's the best part. So the writer digresses a lot, and she digresses into very weird, arcane murder stories. And I came across one that I thought I have to put in the book. Dominic Dunn had this TV show in the early 80s, and it was a huge, long title about crimes and murders. And it was very long. But in it, he profiles this Palm Beach murder. And there was this white guy from Boston who was very working class, but had gone to a good school and had some uncle and some bottling business in Georgia. So he inherited a little money. And he met this woman, this very patrician Black woman from real Black society in Atlanta. And whatever she saw in him, I don't know, they married each other. So they go to Palm Beach, and Palm Beach was pretty racist at the time. So though he's very rough around the edges, he's starting to make an entry into Palm Beach society, and they want nothing to do with her. And they live in this house that is known as the Ham and Cheese House, which to me was the best part of the story. And it's called the Ham and Cheese House because it's white coral keystone and red brick in stripes. So the ham and cheese. Anyway, she's not amused. She's a very elegant lady and decides at a certain point, I really don't want to hang around here if I'm not socially welcome. So she goes back to Atlanta. The divorce is going through. The day before it goes through, she gets a flower delivery. She opens the door and they shoot her. Someone shoots her dead. And it takes years to track down this deadbeat husband. Of course, he did it, and he's married these other women, and he's living in Southeast Asia, but he's in jail right now, and that makes its way into the book. So that's a little bit of local detail that I didn't know before I started.
Yeah, that's
You have a question?
No.
Ted Bundy? Yeah.
I have a question. Recently, a lot of the books that my book club has picked to read have major differences in time. You know, you start here and then it's 50 years later, and then you go back to here, and then it's 30 years later with somebody else, and a lot of characters and a lot of time zones. You have two people telling this story, or two different narrators. Are they in the same time? Are the
Yes.
writer and the wife both happening at the
The
same
book
time?
starts in May of 2020 when two surfers, two teenage boys, sneak out of the house and discover actually a severed human hand on the beach. You mentioned that. And it goes back, as the farthest back it goes is 2019. But I timestamp it so you know where you are. So I was talking about that with another writer yesterday. So starting with a prologue that way, which kind of sets the stage. To me, I'll use a movie reference. It's like the beginning of Citizen Kane. It's the end of the story. He's dying. He drops the thing. He says Rosebud. And then you go back and see what happens. So I do that.
Okay.
But it's not all over the place. Yeah.
Based on the genre of your book, and it appears to me where I sit that American society is just fascinated with murder. You have podcasts that are really popular with murder. You have ID channel. You have a bunch of that focus on murder. From where you sit, is your next chapter to focus in on more murders, or it's a great time to have it because everybody seems fascinated. And I think we were glued to our TVs during the Idaho murders and all of that stuff. But your thoughts on that as well in terms of what's next?
Well, first of all, I think one of the reasons we're so fixated on it, I think there's a part of us, I think we feel like if we understand something, we can kind of keep it at bay. It's not going to happen to us. Like, well, what did she do that I'm not going to do? How did she get into that? How did that happen to her? Like my mother, it felt so uncontrollable to her, her perception of what happened to her friend. Not that it's any more controllable that it was the brother, but it's less maybe random. All my books are completely freestanding. They're all thrillers of a sort and thrillers with major twists. I like to write a twist and not a reveal, and you all know the difference. So in a reveal, like if we're in a locker room mystery, one of us is dead, somebody else did it, and at a certain point we find out who. A twist, you get to a point where you realize, wait a second, something is going on here that I did not realize what was going on. So that's what I write. But they're all very different as stories. My first two books are not really based on a true crime. So the book I'm working on now, I'll give you a little hint. I got an email some months ago from a man, and it began, remember me? I was your best boy in survival game. Now that's a very provocative opening sentence. But if you were in the movie business, you know that a best boy is the head electrician, and survival game was a movie I did. So I'm like, okay, I don't remember him yet, but we've got some facts here. That's correct. And he said, remember that Thanksgiving dinner we had together? And I'm thinking, he said, you were the only actress that nobody came to see for the holidays. I'm like, I don't remember that. What was going on with me? Why was I this lonely soul? I still don't remember him. And he said, you remember when I ran into you a couple years later at the Cannes Film Festival? I was in the British Pavilion. You were standing outside, waving to me through a window, holding a baby. And I wondered for a moment if the child was mine, but I knew that couldn't be possible. I'm like, I really hope that wasn't possible. It's so I got to think, what if you have a woman with a flawed memory and you have someone who comes to her with these touch points?
Yeah.
Is he telling the truth? Is he not telling the truth? So right now I'm calling it Best Boy. And I'm playing with that. And I'm setting it in Connecticut. And my husband's very funny. I like I said, I pick these real places. And he's always saying, oh, we're going to get kicked out of Watch Hill. Oh, we're going to get kicked out of Palm Beach. So maybe we'll get kicked out of Connecticut. I don't know.
Did you ever remember him?
He's more knowable than perhaps I will make him in the book. I looked him up. He's a writer. He had this whole motorcycle life, and he's written about motorcycles and these big motocross tours and stuff. So interesting, handsome fellow, no memory. Then someone else asked me the other day, are you going to tell the real guy that you're writing him? And I'm like, gee, I probably should. Like, thanks for the inspiration. I hope you weren't using that term, because now it's very unsettling to have someone give you such a string of touch points with no memory. Yeah. Well,
I've got one more question. I really thought it was interesting what you mentioned about nonfiction and fiction, and I prefer fiction completely. I'm curious, as you were writing Reef Road, though, were there any details of the nonfiction portion of the story that you felt, I guess, like you had to navigate particularly carefully, or like, did you have in mind, people who might recognize those similarities, and how did you navigate those questions, I guess, that came up for you?
So, a bit of an interesting position with that. So the case is 75 years old this year. So 48 to 23 is 75 years. The brother's still alive. Like I said, I Google him once in a blue moon. It's completely knowable. Someone posted something in her stories from a talk I did yesterday, who said, I've tracked it down. This is a newspaper article. And I didn't repost it. I haven't called attention to it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying in a real way that I think the brother did it. I mean, whatever happens in the book. It is, so it's based on a real crime, but it is fiction. I really do use the details of the date, the time, the events, all of that. But did I keep anything out of it? It's all pretty much in there.
Excellent.
Yeah,
If you were approached by somebody who wanted to write, what would be the first bit of advice you'd give to that person who wanted to become a novelist or some sort of writer?
so one of the best things I've ever done was to be in writing groups. And if you can be in a writing group with kind people, I'm a big believer in kind people. You're really there to help each other. And one of the things that I got out of writing groups, because as a woman of a certain age, I started publishing later in life. And being in these writing groups for many years before I published, I started to gain confidence in my voice, because we would read things, and when it's not that you write for your peers, but you start to notice what they like about your voice, and you don't modify it for them, but you gain confidence in, oh, that's something about the way I write, whether I'm funny or whether I have a certain way of approaching. I do this thing called Friday Reads on Instagram, where I talk about other people's books. And I have one that'll come out next week on Friday, where I'm talking about Elizabeth Strout. And one of the things I like about her writing is she says her sentences in a really odd way sometimes. She like puts as a preposition something that I would have at the end, or I wish I could think of an example. And so it's so odd to me, her sentences, that it slows me down, and I read it again and I pay attention to the thought. And I don't think she does that as a trick. I think she probably, that's the way she writes a sentence. So I think if she'd been with the wrong writing teacher, the wrong writing teacher would have said, you need to rephrase that. But in fact, she doesn't need to rephrase it. It's her phrasing that's interesting. So that would be a big recommendation. That's been really good for me.
I could ask another one. Did your mother know the brother? I mean, because there's a significant age difference from 12 to 19.
Right, she doesn't really remember him. And so for her, when I was doing all this research, and there is a whole bunch of material, is that my phone? Let me just turn that off. There's a bunch of material that in the newspapers, the brother, oh, it's not my phone. The brother refers to having something of a physical relationship with his sister. It is referred to, and then he takes it back in other interviews. So that was so shocking to my mother, the concept. My mother was a very young 12-year-old, and I think my friend Carol was a more physically mature 12-year-old. There were all these allusions in the papers. Like one girl kept saying, well, her father didn't like men looking at her and men winking at her, and she was big for her age. She was quite a beautiful girl. So I think she'd probably gone through puberty well before my mother. But my mom doesn't remember the brother really. I mean, that 7 years he was working at the railroad yard. There were all these questions on that night of, was he at the railroad yard the whole evening? Did he leave? Did he come back? Did he have different shoes? Did he have a different shirt? There were people who kept changing what they said. The dad was a chauffeur. And I don't know, there were too many favors done for the family that I got to thinking, well, maybe the dad drove for certain really prominent leaders of Pittsburgh. It was very odd the way the whole thing was handled.